The torchlight danced across the jagged mine walls like demons celebrating in hell. Wicasa Lone Bear's heart hammered against his ribs as he pressed his back against the cold stone, feeling the familiar weight of his colt against his hip. The stench of unwashed bodies and terror hung thick in the air, mixing with gunpowder smoke from the guards' weapons. His pulse thundered in his ears, drowning out the crude laughter of the assembled bidders. 32 years of war hunting and survival had taught him to read dangerous situations, but nothing had prepared him for this moment. The abandoned silver mine outside Santa Fe harbored the territory's most vicious secret, a human auction where kidnapped women were sold like livestock to the highest bidder. The memory hit him like a physical blow. 5-year-old Ayanna scrambling up the cottonwood tree, her small hands gripping bark as she called down, "Higher than you, Wicasa, I can touch the sky." Her laughter had been pure joy, untainted by the horrors that would soon tear their world apart. He'd promised her that day, as he helped her down from the swaying branches, that he would always protect her. 16 years. 16 years of following cold trails, chasing ghosts, and clinging to hope that grew thinner with each passing season. His magnificent paint stallion Thunderwalker waited in the desert darkness outside the horse that had carried him through cavalry charges and midnight raids across endless miles of hostile territory. Tonight, if the spirits willed it, Thunderwalker would buy his sister's freedom. "Fresh merchandise, gentlemen." The auctioneer's voice ricocheted off the cavern walls, his gold-capped teeth glinting in the flickering light. Prime quality from the Colorado raids. Lone Bear's weathered hand moved instinctively to the medicine pouch at his throat, the one containing his mother's last gift, a small eagle feather blessed by the tribal shaman. If Ayanna truly stood on that platform, he would need all the spiritual strength his ancestors could provide. The mine entrance erupted in sudden violence. Gunshots cracked like thunder as someone fought desperately against the guards. A woman's scream cut through the chaos, followed by the sickening sound of a rifle butt striking flesh. Then deadly silence broken only by nervous chuckling from the crowd. "Gentlemen," the auctioneer announced, wiping blood from a scratch on his cheek. "The entertainment begins now." 3 days earlier, Moses Whitehawk had staggered into Lone Bear's camp along the Rio Grande. At dawn, his weathered face flushed with exhaustion and something that might have been hope. The old half-breed trapper collapsed beside the dying fire, his rheumy eyes bright with urgency. "I've seen her," Moses gasped, accepting the water gourd Lone Bear offered. "Your sister, I'd stake my life on it." Lone Bear had heard such words before, always followed by disappointment, always ending in another dead trail. But something in Moses's voice made him set down his coffee cup and listen carefully. Woman in Las Vegas, maybe 21 years old. Dark bronze skin, but dressed like Eastern folk. She was arguing with 3 men outside the Grande Hotel, fought like a cornered mountain cat when they tried to grab her. Moses pulled out a crumpled piece of paper, his hands shaking with age and excitement. Merchant named Sanchez witnessed the whole thing. Said, when one of those men mentioned the word family, she went white as fresh snow and clutched something at her throat. Something that caught the light. Lone Bear's breath caught. What kind of something? Silver locket on a chain. Old, tarnished, the kind that holds precious memories. Moses's voice dropped to a whisper. Sanchez got close enough to see her face when the light hit it just right. She's got the look of our people, but hidden somehow. Like she's been pretending to be something else for so long, she's forgotten her true nature. The old trapper touched his own forehead. And she's got a scar right here. Thin white line, just like little Ayanna got when she fell from that cottonwood tree by the river. Moses continued, his voice growing more urgent. She was shouting about some letter said a man named Caldwell would kill her for it. Then those men dragged her away, heading south toward the Badlands. Word on the trading posts is they're taking her to the old Esperanza mine for auction 3 nights from now. Lone Bear was already moving, rolling his blankets with practiced efficiency. "You certain about the scar?" "Certain as sunrise. And there's something else. She's got a crooked finger on her right hand. Little finger bent at an odd angle like it was broken and healed wrong." The detail hit Lone Bear like a war club. Ayanna had broken that finger at age 4, trying to catch a hawk that had swooped too close to their lodge. The finger had healed crookedly, despite their mother's careful ministrations. "Moses," he said quietly, "if you're wrong about this, I'm not wrong," the old trapper said firmly. "That girl is blood of your blood, or I'm not the man who saved her from a lodge fire when she was barely 3 years old." The memory made Lone Bear's hands still. Moses had been visiting their village when lightning struck their lodge during a summer storm. He'd pulled Ayanna from the flames while Lone Bear was helping their father fight the fire. The old trapper had always claimed a special bond with the girl after that day. "She's alive, boy," Moses said, struggling to his feet. "And she needs you now more than ever." Within the hour, Lone Bear had broken camp and begun the hard ride toward Santa Fe. Now standing in the fetid air of the mine, he studied the women on the makeshift platform with the focused intensity of a hunting wolf. The first 3 women were clearly wrong. 2 old wrong features, no distinguishing marks. The 4th was a Mexican girl barely 16, her face streaked with terror. But at the platform's far end stood a woman who made Lone Bear's heart hammer against his ribs. She appeared to be in her early 20s with long dark hair hanging in tangles around her shoulders. Her skin held the warm bronze tone of the people, though it looked as if she'd spent years trying to lighten it with powders and avoiding the sun. Even in the dim torchlight, he could see the thin white scar crossing her right eyebrow, exactly where Ayanna's had been. Her torn green dress revealed the distinctive crook in her little finger, and despite the chains binding her wrists, she held herself with the proud defiance of a Comanche warrior. When a drunken bidder reached toward her, she bit his hand hard enough to draw blood, earning a vicious backhand that would have felled a weaker woman. "State your name for the bidders," the auctioneer commanded, his voice carrying the oily smoothness of a professional deceiver. "I am Catherine Walker," she declared, her voice ringing clearly through the mine. "I am a citizen of the United States of America, and I demand my immediate release." The auctioneer's whip cracked near her feet. "You'll be whatever your new owner wants you to be, darling. Names can be changed easy enough." She flinched, but straightened her shoulders. When someone in the crowd called out something about Indian blood, she turned toward Lone Bear with such fierce hatred that he stepped back instinctively. Her eyes held no recognition, only the blazing defiance of a woman who'd survived unthinkable horrors. "Miravkir, what am I bid for this spirited wildcat?" the auctioneer announced. Fresh from Colorado territory, educated, can read and write. Perfect for domestic service or specialized entertainment. A railroad man in a silk vest raised his hand. $50. 75, called a gambler with tobacco stains decorating his beard. Lone Bear watched Catherine test her bonds, her movements calculated and efficient. She was searching for weaknesses, looking for any opportunity to escape. The careful way she studied the room reminded him of Ayanna at 5 years old, always thinking, always planning, never accepting defeat. 150 from the gentleman in the corner, the auctioneer announced with obvious pleasure. "Do I hear 250? The voice came from a well-dressed man near the platform's front. He wore expensive clothes and carried himself with the arrogance of serious money, the kind of man who bought and sold human lives with the same casual interest as cattle. "Mr. Caldwell bids $250. The auctioneer said, his smile widening like a snake's. "Any advance on $250? Catherine's face went ashen. "No," she whispered, then louder. "No, you can't sell me to him. The letter, he'll kill me." Her chained hand flew to her throat, clutching something beneath her torn dress. Even from his position against the wall, Lone Bear could see the glint of a silver chain. His mother's locket. "$250 going once," the auctioneer called. Lone Bear stepped forward, his boots ringing on the stone floor. Every eye in the mine turned toward him, the tall Comanche warrior with a scarred face and the bearing of a man who'd killed and would kill again. His heart hammered, but his voice remained steady. "I'll trade my Warhorse in this." He pulled the medicine pouch from his throat, the sacred pouch containing his mother's eagle feather, blessed by the shaman before his first vision quest. Together, they're worth more than all the gold in this cursed hole. The auctioneer's eyebrows shot up. "Your horse and some Indian trinket. That paint stallion outside is worth $500 if he's worth a penny," said one of the guards who'd been watching the entrance. "And that pouch." He lowered his voice. "That's medicine. Bad luck to refuse medicine." A murmur rippled through the crowd. In this country, a good horse meant survival, and a trained warhorse was beyond price. The medicine pouch added an element of superstition that made even hardened outlaws uneasy. Caldwell's face darkened. "I bid $400. Your gold against my horse and my medicine." Lone Bear said, his voice cutting through the murmur. "Winner takes all." The auctioneer looked between them, calculating. The horse and pouch were worth more than the gold, but cash was easier to divide among his crew. Finally, greed won out. "Sold to the Comanche," he announced. "Let's see this famous horse." Catherine stared at Lone Bear with a mixture of terror and confusion. "You're buying me?" she whispered. Before he could answer, chaos erupted. Caldwell's men reached for their weapons, enraged at being outbid. The auctioneer shouted orders. Guards moved toward the platform with rifles raised. Lone Bear was already moving. He drew his Colt in one fluid motion, putting 2 bullets into the nearest guard, while diving toward Catherine. A rifle cracked from the tunnel entrance reinforcements, rushing in from outside. The chain holding Catherine to the other women snapped under the impact of a stray bullet. She looked up at him with wide, frightened eyes, blood from a grazed cheek mixing with tears she refused to shed. "Who are you?" she gasped. "Someone who's been looking for you for 16 years?" he replied, then half-carried, half-dragged her toward the mine's back passages as gunfire erupted behind them. The tunnel stretched into darkness, lit only by occasional torches wedged into cracks in the walls. Behind them, shouts and gunfire echoed as the outlaws organized pursuit. Lone Bear's shoulder burned where a bullet had grazed him. But he kept moving, one hand gripping Catherine's arm, the other holding his smoking revolver. "Release me immediately," she hissed, trying to pull away. "You're just another kidnapper. If I wanted to harm you, I'd have left you on that platform." He said, his voice barely audible over their footsteps on stone. "There's an exit through the old mining shafts. I scouted it yesterday while watching this place." The crack of a rifle cut him off. Rock fragments exploded from the wall beside his head, stinging his cheek with sharp splinters. 2 men on horseback had entered from the mine's rear entrance, professional bounty hunters, by their look well-armed and moving with practiced efficiency. "Target acquired," one shouted, pointing toward Lone Bear and Catherine. Caldwell's orders were to bring the woman back breathing. Lone Bear pushed Catherine behind a support timber as bullets whined through the air. The hunters had dismounted and were advancing on foot, using the mine's natural cover to close the distance methodically. "Caldwell." Catherine whispered, her face draining of color. "He found me again." "Who is he to you?" Lone Bear asked, reloading his Colt with practiced speed. "It's complicated," she said, her voice tight with old pain. "He was my husband, former husband. The marriage was ended under violent circumstances." The words hit him like a physical blow. His sister married to a man who would buy her at an outlaw auction. The pieces refused to fit together in any way that made sense. A bullet sparked off the support timber inches from his head. The bounty hunters were getting closer, their shots more accurate. Without Thunderwalker, escape across the desert would be nearly impossible, but staying meant certain death. "Can you handle a gun?" he asked Catherine. She nodded, accepting the spare revolver he offered. Her hands shook, but her grip looked steady. "I've learned many unpleasant skills since my ordeal began." They broke from cover, running toward the mine's back entrance. The desert moonlight outside was brilliant, turning the landscape into a silver maze of shadows and sage. Lone Bear led Catherine through a narrow gap in the rocks, their bodies scraping against stone as they squeezed through. Behind them, the bounty hunters had found their trail and were calling to others. The hunt was on. "This way," Lone Bear whispered, pointing toward a dry creek bed that wound through the desert floor. "We can lose them in the arroyos." They ran through the moonlight, Catherine's torn dress catching on thorns and sagebrush. Behind them, the sound of hoofbeats grew steadily closer. Two riders, both armed with rifles, both determined to earn their blood money. The first bullet took a chunk from the boulder beside Lone Bear's head. The second punched through his left shoulder, spinning him around and sending him tumbling into the creek bed. Hot blood soaked his shirt, looking black in the moonlight. Catherine knelt beside him, her hands moving to examine the wound with surprising skill. "How severe?" she asked, her voice steady despite the fear in her eyes. "I'll survive," he said through gritted teeth, "but I can't outrun them like this." She tore a strip from her petticoat, her movements quick and efficient. As she bandaged his shoulder, her fingers found the bullet's path with almost surgical precision. "You've been shot before," she observed. "Too many times to count." "So have I." The words were spoken so quietly, he almost missed them. When he looked up, she was staring at a small, star-shaped scar on her left forearm and the unmistakable mark of a bullet's passage. The hoofbeats were getting closer. Lone Bear struggled to his feet, his shoulder on fire, blood seeping through the makeshift bandage. Catherine helped him, her arm around his waist, supporting more of his weight than he wanted to admit. "Why?" she asked suddenly. "Why did you trade your horse and sacred medicine for me?" He looked at her in the moonlight, seeing not the frightened woman, but the ghost of a 5-year-old girl with the same defiant spirit. "Because I made a promise to someone that I'd bring you home," he said. Before she could ask, who the bounty hunters appeared on the ridge above them, their rifles glinting in the silver light like instruments of death. The dry creek bed offered some protection, but not enough. Lone Bear pressed himself against the rocky wall, Catherine beside him, both breathing hard from their desperate flight. Above them, the bounty hunters were dismounting, taking their time now that they had cornered their prey. Raphael Caldwell pays handsomely for his property. One of them called down his voice, carrying a slight Spanish accent. "Señora, you come up peaceful, and the Indian doesn't have to die tonight." Catherine's hand went to her throat, clutching the locket chain. "He's not my husband," she whispered to Lone Bear. "Not anymore. Not after what he did." "What did he do?" She was quiet for a long moment, staring at the silver chain between her fingers. "I discovered a letter in his private study about a federal marshal named Morrison who was investigating his illegal land grants. The letter was in Raphael's handwriting, ordering Morrison's death. A rifle bullet chipped stone near Lone Bear's ear. The hunters were moving closer, using the moonlight to track their movements. That was 3 years ago. Catherine continued. "I tried to turn the letter over to the territorial authorities, but Raphael discovered what I'd done. He arranged for me to be kidnapped during a staged stagecoach robbery, told everyone I was killed by Comanche raiders." Lone Bear studied her face in the moonlight. Everything about her physical appearance pointed to her being Ayanna, but her story spoke of a different kind of captivity, one that had begun long after his sister's disappearance. "What about before Caldwell?" he asked. "Your childhood. Where did you grow up?" She hesitated, her eyes becoming distant. "Back east, Pennsylvania. A family named Walker took me in when I was young." They said they found me after an Indian attack that killed my birth parents." She touched the scar on her forehead. "This is from when I was 6. I fell from a tree, struck my head hard. After that, everything before was foggy." Lone Bear's heart hammered. Ayanna had been 5 when taken. A head injury at 6 could have damaged her memories, explained why she didn't recognize him. But it could also be mere coincidence. "Let me see the locket," he said quietly. Catherine's grip tightened on the chain. "Why?" "Because I believe I know what's inside it." Above them, one of the bounty hunters was working his way down the creek bed, his boots crunching on loose stone. They had minutes at most before he reached them. Catherine hesitated, then pulled the locket from beneath her dress. It was silver tarnished with age, hanging on a delicate chain. With trembling fingers, she opened it. Inside nestled a silver coin, no bigger than a man's thumb. Even in the dim moonlight, Lone Bear could see the intricate engraving symbols that had been carved by his grandfather's hand, passed down through generations of his family. At the center was the bear claw mark that identified their clan. "Where did you get this?" he whispered. "I've always had it. The walkers said it was around my neck when they found me after the attack." She stared at the coin, her brow furrowed in concentration. "Sometimes I dream about it. About a woman with kind eyes placing it around my neck. She spoke words I didn't understand, but somehow I knew she was saying goodbye." Lone Bear's throat tightened. "What did she look like?" "Dark hair like mine. Beautiful but heartbroken. She was weeping when she gave it to me." The bounty hunter was close now, his shadow visible on the creek bed wall. Lone Bear checked his revolver, 3 bullets left. Catherine still held the spare gun, but he doubted she'd ever taken a life. "Catherine," he said quietly, "I need you to listen carefully. That coin was made by my grandfather 70 years ago. It belonged to my mother. She gave it to my sister the night before slavers took her from our village." Catherine's face went pale. "That's impossible. I'm not—" "Your name wasn't always Catherine Walker. It was Ayanna. Little Ayanna, who could climb higher than any boy in the village, who broke her finger trying to catch a hawk when she was 4, who got that scar falling from the cottonwood tree by the river." "No," Catherine whispered, but her voice lacked conviction. "My mother told you the coin would keep you safe, and it did. It kept you alive long enough for me to find you." The bounty hunter rounded the bend rifle raised. Lone Bear fired first his bullet, catching the man in the shoulder and spinning him around. His second shot went wide, and the third clicked on an empty chamber. Catherine raised her pistol with both hands, her face set in grim determination. But when the moment came to pull the trigger, her hands shook and the shot went high. The bounty hunter's return fire was more accurate. His bullet grazed Lone Bear's thigh, and a second punched through Catherine's left shoulder, slamming her against the creek bed wall. "Ayanna," Lone Bear shouted, reaching for her. At the sound of the name, Catherine's eyes went wide. For just a moment, something flickered in her expression, a flash of recognition, of memory, trying to surface like a swimmer breaking through dark water. Then the second bounty hunter appeared on the ridge above, and the night exploded into violence. The second bounty hunter was older, more experienced, and moved with the confidence of a man who'd never lost a fight. His rifle was trained on Catherine, who lay bleeding against the creek bed wall, her face pale with shock and pain. "Easy now, Comanche," he said, his voice carrying the authority of years spent tracking human prey. "The woman's been shot, and she'll bleed out without proper attention. You surrender now, and maybe we can all walk away from this." Lone Bear's empty revolver felt like dead weight in his hand. His shoulder and thigh throbbed, and Catherine was losing blood fast. The smart play was surrender. The honorable play was to die fighting. "The name's Miguel Ruiz." The bounty hunter continued, moving closer. "I've been tracking runaway property for 15 years. Seen a lot of interesting cases, but this one—" He gestured toward Catherine with his rifle barrel. "This one's got me genuinely puzzled." Catherine was conscious but weak, her good hand pressed against the bullet wound. "Don't listen to him," she gasped. "He's one of Caldwell's hired killers." "Oh, I work for Caldwell now," Ruiz agreed. "But I've worked for other people before. Lot of other people going back many years." His eyes fixed on the locket still clutched in Catherine's hand. "Including some folks who took a little Comanche girl from a burned village about 16 years ago." The words hit Lone Bear like a physical blow. "You were there." "I was young then, stupid. Thought I was just following orders, making some quick money." Ruiz's voice carried a note of genuine regret. "But I remember that coin. Hell, I remember the whole family. The mother tried to fight, got herself killed protecting the little one. The father was already dead from the first attack. And the girl," he looked directly at Catherine, his weathered face thoughtful. "The girl had a scar on her forehead and a crooked finger. Kept crying for her brother, kept saying Wicasa over and over. That's not a name you forget." Catherine's face went white. "Wicasa." She whispered the word, seeming to rise from somewhere deep in her memory like water from a long dry well. "That's what she called you," Ruiz said to Lone Bear. "Her big brother. She was maybe 5 years old, terrified out of her mind, but she kept asking when Wicasa was coming to get her." "What happened to her?" Lone Bear asked, his voice barely controlled. "We sold her to a preacher and his wife heading east. They said they'd give her a good Christian home, teach her to be civilized. Seemed like a mercy at the time." Ruiz shook his head. "But I kept that coin as a souvenir. Sold it to a trader a few years later when I needed drinking money." "Then how did I get it?" Catherine asked, her voice weak but insistent. "Good question," Ruiz said. "Because I sold it to a man named Walker. Thomas Walker, traveling with his wife through Colorado territory. They were looking for a child to adopt, something about not being able to have their own. But before anyone could respond, then the first bounty hunter, Carlos, wounded but still dangerous, raised his rifle again. "Enough talk," he snarled. "Caldwell's paying us to bring back his property, not to stand around telling stories. Problem is Carlos," Ruiz said, his voice taking on a different tone. "She's not Caldwell's property, never was. She's a kidnapped Comanche girl who got sold around like a piece of furniture." "Don't matter what's legal," Carlos said. "Matters what pays." "What about the letter she mentioned?" Ruiz asked. "The one about Morrison getting killed. You think Caldwell wants word of that getting out?" Carlos's face went hard. "All the more reason to finish this clean. No witnesses, no problems." He swung his rifle toward Catherine, but Ruiz was faster. His shot took Carlos center mass, dropping him instantly. The sound echoed through the creek bed, followed by an eerie silence. "Why?" Lone Bear asked, his voice hoarse. Ruiz lowered his smoking rifle. "Because I've got 4 grandchildren now. 4 beautiful babies who deserve to grow up in a world where men like me don't steal little girls from their families." He looked at Catherine, bleeding and semi-conscious against the rocky wall. "Maybe it's time to balance the scales?" Catherine stirred, her eyes fluttering open. "The letter," she whispered. "I hid it. In the locket. Behind the coin. If something happens to me, nothing's going to happen to you," Lone Bear said firmly, but he could see the truth in her pale face. Without medical help, she wouldn't last the night. As if summoned by his desperation, the sound of hoofbeats echoed across the desert. But these weren't the iron-shod horses of white men, and these were unshod ponies, ridden by men who knew how to move like spirits through the night. Lone Bear's heart leaped. His people had come looking for him. The Comanche war party materialized from the darkness like vengeful spirits, 6 warriors on paint ponies, their faces streaked with traditional war paint. At their head rode Joseph Crow Feather, Lone Bear's blood brother, and the tribe's most skilled tracker, They had followed Thunderwalker's distinctive hoof prints from the Rio Grande, drawn by the distant sound of gunfire. Brother Crow Feather called out in their native tongue, dismounting and running to where Lone Bear knelt beside Catherine. "We heard the shooting. Are you—" He stopped, his eyes widening as he saw the wounded woman. "Is this—" he asked quietly, switching to English for Catherine's benefit. "Ayana," Lone Bear confirmed. "But she's dying." Crow Feather examined Catherine's wound with experienced hands. "The bullet went clean through. She's lost much blood, but if we can get her to the village medicine woman—" "That's 2 days' hard ride," Lone Bear said. "She doesn't have 2 days. Then we make it faster," Crow Feather said grimly. He turned to his warriors. "Cut poles for a travois. We leave immediately." As the warriors prepared the makeshift stretcher, Ruiz stepped forward. "I'm coming with you." "No," Lone Bear said sharply. "You've done enough damage for 1 lifetime. I'm the only one who can testify about what happened 16 years ago," Ruiz said. "And I'm the only witness besides her who knows about Caldwell's letter. You want justice for your sister, you need me alive." "He's right," Catherine said weakly. "The letter, it's not enough by itself. You need someone who can explain how Morrison really died." Lone Bear studied the bounty hunter's weathered face. "Why should I trust you?" "Because I've got nothing left to lose," Ruiz said quietly. "And because I owe her a debt that can't be paid with money." They fashioned the travois from young cottonwood poles and buffalo hide, creating a rough but functional stretcher. Catherine drifted in and out of consciousness as they lifted her onto it, her breathing shallow and labored. "Wicasa," she whispered, using the name that had haunted her dreams for 16 years. "Is it really you?" "It's me, little sister," Lone Bear said, taking her hand. "I'm here. I remember now. Fragments. A tree by the river. You carved something in the bark, our names together." Lone Bear's throat tightened. "You were only 5. I thought you might not remember." "I remember everything now," she said, her voice growing stronger despite her wounds. "The village, the games we played, the stories our mother told about the star spirits. And I remember the night they came. The fire, the screaming, the men with guns and ropes. Don't think about that now," Lone Bear said. "Save your strength." But Catherine's eyes were bright with fever and returning memory. "They separated us. I kept calling for you, but you didn't come. I thought you were dead too. I was away on my vision quest," Lone Bear said, his voice heavy with 16 years of guilt. "By the time I returned, the village was ash, our parents were dead, and you were gone. I've been searching for you ever since." 16 years, Catherine whispered. "You never stopped looking." "I gave our mother my word that I'd protect you," Lone Bear said. "A warrior's word is sacred." They began the desperate journey toward the Comanche village, riding hard through the night. Catherine's condition worsened with each mile, her fever rising, her breathing becoming more labored. At dawn, they stopped in a small grove of cottonwoods to rest the horses and check her wounds. "The shoulder's infected," Crow Feather said quietly. "Even if we reach the village, I don't know if the medicine woman can save her." Lone Bear knelt beside his sister, watching her face in the growing light. She was beautiful still, despite the years of hardship and pain. But she was slipping away, and there was nothing he could do to stop it. "Wicasa," she whispered, her eyes opening. "Look in the locket, behind the coin." "Keep it," he said. "Mother meant for you to have it. Please, the letter is there. But there's something else too." Her voice was barely audible. "Another locket. I found it in Caldwell's things the night I discovered the letter. I never had a chance to open it before he had me kidnapped." She fumbled with something hidden in her dress, pulling out a second locket, this one newer, less ornate. I think it might be important. With trembling fingers, Lone Bear opened the first locket and found the tiny catch that held the coin in place. Behind it was a piece of paper folded so small it was barely visible. He unfolded it carefully, revealing a handwritten note. "Morrison asks too many questions about the railroad grants," he read aloud. "Take care of the problem permanently. Make it look accidental. R. Caldwell?" "That's his handwriting," Catherine said weakly. "I watched him write it. That's why he had me kidnapped, why he's been hunting me. That letter proves he's a murderer." Then Lone Bear opened the second locket. Inside was a small photograph of a kind-faced woman with gentle eyes and graying hair. On the back in faded ink were the words, "To my beloved Catherine, may you find peace in whatever path you choose. With eternal love, Mother Walker." Catherine stared at the photograph, tears streaming down her face. "She knew," she whispered. "She knew I wasn't really her daughter, but she loved me anyway. And now we have the proof we need," Ruiz said grimly. "But first, we need to get you to that medicine woman." Behind them, fresh dust clouds appeared on the horizon. Caldwell's main force was coming, and they were running out of time. "No," Catherine said, her voice growing stronger with determination. "First, we need to get these letters to the territorial marshal. If something happens to me, promise you'll see justice done." "Nothing's going to happen to you," Lone Bear said fiercely. "I didn't find you after 16 years just to lose you now." But even as he spoke the words, he could see the truth in her fading eyes. And behind them, the thunder of hoofbeats was growing louder. The sound of approaching riders rolled across the desert like an avalanche. Lone Bear counted at least 12 horses, possibly more, all pushing their mounts to the breaking point. Caldwell had brought an army to retrieve his property and silence any witnesses to his crimes. "Can we outrun them?" Crowfeather asked, checking his Winchester rifle. Lone Bear looked at Catherine, pale and fevered on the travois. "Not with her condition, and not without killing our horses. Then we make our stand," Crowfeather said grimly. He pointed to a cluster of red rock formations ahead, ancient sandstone pillars that rose from the desert floor like giant fingers. "Good defensive position. They'll have to come at us through the gaps." But as they approached the rocks, Lone Bear remembered something. Years ago, an old Apache warrior named Gray Eagle had told him about this place, how it connected to a network of hidden caves that his people had once used as escape routes during the cavalry wars. "Wait," he said, studying the formations. "Gray Eagle once told me these rocks had secret passages, Apache hideouts from the old days." "You're gambling our lives on old stories," Crowfeather said. "No, better than certain death out here," Lone Bear replied. "Look for any opening that doesn't appear natural, something that might be concealed." The Comanche warriors moved with practiced efficiency, positioning themselves behind the rock formations while searching for the hidden passage. Lone Bear helped carry Catherine's travois into the deepest part of the natural fortress, where the stone walls offered maximum protection. "I can fight," she whispered, struggling to sit up. "You can barely stay conscious," Lone Bear said, pressing her back down. "Let us handle this. If we don't survive this, those letters die with us," she said urgently. "Caldwell wins. Morrison's family never gets justice. We'll survive," Lone Bear said, but he was counting ammunition as he spoke. Between all of them, they had maybe 70 rounds total. Against 12 or more professional gunmen, those odds were grim. "There," one of the warriors shouted, pointing to what looked like a deep shadow between two towering rock pillars. Behind that rockfall, Lone Bear squinted at the spot and saw at a gap in the stones that had been cleverly concealed by fallen boulders. It was barely wide enough for a horse, but it might be their only chance. "Raphael," a voice boomed across the desert. "I know you're in there somewhere. The voice belonged to Caldwell himself. Lone Bear could hear the cultured Eastern accent even at this distance. The man had come personally to retrieve his property. Catherine, Caldwell called. My dear wife, you've caused me considerable trouble. Catherine's face contorted with rage and terror. I'm not your wife, she screamed back. Our marriage was annulled by your crimes. Miguel. Caldwell's voice took on a different tone. Miguel Ruiz, you've broken our agreement. Ruiz cupped his hands around his mouth. Your agreement was for property retrieval, not murder. That woman stole from me. She's a thief and a liar. She's a kidnapped Comanche woman. Lone Bear's voice boomed across the rocks. And she's under the protection of the Comanche Nation. A moment of silence. Then Caldwell's voice again, closer now, and filled with cold fury. The half-breed killer speaks. You have no authority here. I have the authority of blood and justice, Lone Bear replied. And you're about to answer for your crimes. The attack came without warning. Caldwell's men had spread out during the conversation, positioning themselves for a coordinated assault. Gunfire erupted from 3 directions simultaneously, bullets sparking off the red rocks and filling the air with deadly fragments. The Comanche warriors fought with desperate skill, their war cries echoing off the stone walls like the voices of ancient spirits. Lone Bear put 3 bullets into attackers trying to flank their position, while Crow Feather's rifle cracked steadily from behind a boulder. They're trying to get above us, one of the warriors shouted. Lone Bear looked up to see several of Caldwell's men scaling the rock face's ropes and climbing gear, allowing them to reach elevated positions. From there, they could rain down fire on the defenders below. The passage, he shouted. Everyone to the passage. They ran for the concealed gap in the rocks, Catherine's travois bumping over rough ground as 2 warriors carried her. Behind them, the sound of dynamite fuses being lit made Lone Bear's blood run cold. They're going to bring down the whole formation, Crow Feather shouted. The passage was even narrower than it had appeared. They had to abandon the travois with Lone Bear carrying Catherine in his arms. Her wounded shoulder made her cry out in pain with each step, but she bit down on her lip and endured. I can't make it, she gasped as they squeezed through the tightest section. Yes, you can, Lone Bear said fiercely. You're Ayanna, daughter of Running Bear, granddaughter of Chief Stone Wolf. You have the blood of warriors in your veins. Something in his words reached her. She straightened, found hidden reserves of strength, and pushed forward. Blood seeped through her dress where the rough stone scraped her wounds, but she didn't stop. The passage opened into a vast, underground cavern dimly lit by shafts of sunlight filtering through cracks in the ceiling. Ancient pictographs covered the walls, Apache symbols telling stories of hunts and battles from generations past. But the cavern was unstable, and the explosions outside were causing rocks to fall from the ceiling. Up there, Ruiz pointed to a series of natural ledges that led toward the light. That's our way out. Catherine looked at the climb and then at her wounded shoulder. I'll never make it. You will, Lone Bear said, because I'm going to help you. He positioned himself below her, his hands supporting her weight as she climbed. Each movement sent fresh waves of pain through her shoulder, but she kept going. Behind them, the cavern was beginning to collapse as more charges exploded outside. Water began seeping through cracks in the floor the explosions had broken through to an underground spring. The rising water added urgency to their desperate climb. Halfway up, Catherine's strength gave out. She hung from a ledge by her good hand, her wounded shoulder screaming in protest. Below them, water was rising rapidly, already waist-deep where they'd been standing. I can't hold on, she gasped. Remember the cottonwood tree? Lone Bear said, climbing beside her. You climbed higher than me that day. You were fearless. I fell from that tree, Catherine said weakly. But you climbed it first, Lone Bear replied. And you conquered your fear. You're going to do the same thing now. Water was rising fast now, nearly reaching their feet. The cavern was flooding, and the walls were beginning to buckle under the pressure. They had minutes before the whole structure collapsed. Catherine found some final reserve of strength. With Lone Bear's help, she hauled herself up onto the ledge, then up another level toward the shaft of sunlight. One by one, they squeezed through the opening and emerged into blessed daylight. They stood on a mesa overlooking the rock formations, which were now partially collapsed and surrounded by rising water. The underground spring had created a muddy lake where the entrance used to be. Caldwell, Crowfeather asked. "He down there," Ruiz said grimly, pointing to the flooded area. "Him and half his men. The others scattered when the rocks started falling." Catherine collapsed onto the sandy ground, her face gray with exhaustion and pain. But she was alive, and more importantly, she was free. "Is it over?" she asked weakly. "It's over," Lone Bear said, kneeling beside her. "You're free, Ayanna, finally free." The territorial marshal arrived in Santa Fe 6 days later, summoned by an urgent telegram from the army garrison. He found Miguel Ruiz waiting in the territorial courthouse, a written confession in his weathered hands, and a story that would make headlines from Denver to San Antonio. Rafael Caldwell was a murderer and a kidnapper. Ruiz testified before the assembled territorial officials, federal investigators, and newspaper reporters. "I have documentary proof of his crimes, and I'm prepared to face the full consequences of my own actions 16 years ago." The letters from Catherine's lockets were authenticated by federal handwriting experts brought in from Denver. Caldwell's network of illegal land deals was exposed, his surviving associates arrested, and his vast estate seized by the territorial government. Morrison's widow, after 3 years of believing her husband had died in a tragic accident, finally learned the truth about his murder. "Justice has been served," the territorial judge announced. "The Caldwell criminal organization is dismantled, and reparations will be paid to all victims' families." Catherine spent 4 weeks recovering in the Army hospital in Santa Fe. The Comanche medicine woman, Sun Dancing Woman, worked alongside the Army surgeon to heal both her body and her fractured spirit. The old woman brought traditional herbs and healing ceremonies that seemed to work better than any white man's medicine. "The shoulder wound has healed cleanly," Dr. Patterson reported to Lone Bear. "She'll have full use of her arm, though there'll always be a scar. But it's the psychological trauma that concerns me most." "What do you mean?" Lone Bear asked. 16 years of forced identity, of being told she was someone else entirely. The human mind doesn't recover from that kind of systematic deception overnight. She may never fully remember her early childhood, or the memories may return in fragments that don't always connect properly. Lone Bear nodded grimly. He'd seen warriors return from battle with invisible wounds that took longer to heal than any bullet or blade could cause. "She's been asking about the village," he said. "Whether she truly belongs there after living as a white woman for so long." "What do you think?" Dr. Patterson asked. "I think she belongs wherever she chooses to be," Lone Bear said. "She's earned the right to decide her own fate." During her recovery, Catherine spent hours with Sun Dancing Woman learning fragments of the Comanche language and traditional healing practices. The old woman had known Catherine's mother and shared stories that helped fill in the gaps in her memory. "Your mother was a great healer," Sun Dancing Woman told her in careful English. "She could make the sick plants grow strong again. You have her hands gentle but strong." Catherine looked at her scarred hands, hands that had learned to fight and survive. "I don't feel gentle." "A gentle is not the same as weak," the old woman said. "Your mother was gentle, but she died fighting for her children. You are gentle, but you survived 16 years of hardship. Different battles, same warrior spirit." On the day Catherine was released from the hospital, she stood in the plaza of Santa Fe, looking out at the vast expanse of desert and mountains that stretched to every horizon. She wore a simple blue dress, provided by the army wives, her long dark hair braided in the traditional Comanche style. "Where will you go now?" Lone Bear asked. "I honestly don't know," she said. For 3 years, I've been running from Caldwell, never able to stay in one place long enough to call it home. Before that, I was trying to be the perfect Eastern wife to a man who wanted me dead. And before that, she touched the faded scar on her forehead. Before that, I was Ayanna, but those memories feel like pieces of a dream. You don't have to choose today, Lone Bear said. The village will be there when you're ready. And if I'm never ready, if I can't fit into that world anymore, then you'll still be my sister, he said simply. Blood calls to blood. Nothing can ever change that. Miguel Ruiz appeared at the plaza's edge, his horse packed for travel. The territorial judge had sentenced him to 15 years in prison for his role in the slavery ring, but had suspended the sentence in exchange for his testimony and cooperation with federal investigators. Where will you go? Catherine asked him. Back to Mexico, he said. I've got family, their grandchildren I haven't seen in years. Time to try being a grandfather instead of a hunter of men. Thank you, she said quietly, for everything you did to help us. Don't thank me yet, Ruiz said. I've got a long road ahead before I balance the scales for what I did all those years ago. But maybe helping you was the first step. He mounted his horse and rode out of the plaza, disappearing into the desert haze. Catherine watched him go, then turned back to Lone Bear. I want to see the village, she said. Not to stay permanently, not yet. But I want to see where I came from. Are you certain? I'm certain, she said. And for the first time in weeks, she smiled genuinely. I want to see that cottonwood tree by the river, the one where you carved our names. The journey to the Comanche village took 7 days, following ancient trails through country that seemed hauntingly familiar to Catherine, even though she couldn't consciously remember traveling it before. Sometimes she would stop and stare at a particular rock formation or bend in a stream, her eyes distant with half-remembered dreams. Does it feel familiar? Lone Bear asked during one such pause. Yes and no, she said thoughtfully. Like trying to remember a song you heard as a small child. You know the melody exists somewhere in your mind, but most of the words have vanished. They traveled through different landscapes, not just endless desert, but also pine forests in the mountains and green valleys fed by clear streams. The diversity of the land surprised Catherine, who had imagined the territory as nothing but sand and sage. The village was larger than she'd expected, with dozens of buffalo-hide teepees arranged in traditional circles around a central gathering area. People came out to watch as they approached. Word had spread throughout the tribe that Lone Bear's lost sister had been found, and the entire community was curious to see if the old stories were true. An elderly woman approached, her weathered face lined with emotion. Ayanna, she said in the Comanche language. Child of my heart, can it truly be you? Catherine looked at her blankly, not understanding the words. But something in the woman's eyes, some deep wellspring of familiarity, made her step forward instinctively. This is your grandmother, Lone Bear said quietly. Your mother's mother. Her name is Singing Bird. Singing Bird took Catherine's face gently in her hands, studying features she'd mourned for 16 years. You have your mother's eyes, she said in careful English. But your spirit feels different. Harder like metal that has been forged in fire. I've had to be hard to survive, Catherine said. Yes. Singing Bird nodded with understanding. I can see that in your bearing. But hardness can be softened again, given time and love. They showed her through the village, pointing out places where she'd played as a child, introducing her to people who remembered her laughter. The ancient cottonwood tree by the river was still there, much larger now, its massive trunk scarred by age and weather, but still proudly standing. There, Lone Bear pointed to a place on the bark about 4 feet from the ground. Can you see it? Catherine stepped closer, running her fingers over the rough bark. The letters were faded and distorted by years of growth, but they were still clearly visible W and A carved in the uncertain hand of a 7-year-old boy trying to please his little sister. I remember, she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. I remember you lifting me up so I could reach high enough to carve the A. I was so proud that my letter was next to yours. You were always trying to keep up with me. Lone Bear said, his own voice rough with 16 years of suppressed grief, even when you were barely old enough to walk steadily. Catherine touched the carved letters again, and suddenly more memories came flooding back. Not all of them, but enough. Running through the village with other children, their laughter echoing off the teepees. Helping her mother prepare meals, learning to bead moccasins. Listening to stories around the fire as darkness fell across the prairie. I remember the night they came, she said, suddenly tears streaming down her face. You were gone on your vision quest, and I was so frightened. Mother hid me in the root cellar, but they found me anyway. She fought them, didn't she? She died trying to protect me. Yes, Lone Bear said simply. She fought like a warrior defending her young. She earned a warrior's death. And our father, he fell defending the village entrance. He took 3 of them with him before they brought him down. Catherine nodded, understanding filling her eyes. I need to visit their graves. The burial ground sat on a hill overlooking the village, marked by traditional stone cairns, decorated with beads, feathers, and other meaningful objects. Catherine knelt beside her parents' graves, her hands trembling as she placed wildflowers on the weathered stones. I'm sorry, she whispered to the spirits of the dead. I'm sorry I couldn't remember you for so long. I'm sorry I let them make me forget who I was. You didn't let them do anything, Lone Bear said firmly. You were a child taken by force and raised by people who meant well, but didn't understand what they were doing to you. You survived the only way you could. But I was Catherine Walker for so long. I don't know if I can truly be Ayanna again. You don't have to choose one or the other, Lone Bear said. You can be both or neither or someone entirely new. The name doesn't define who you are. What matters is that you're here, you're alive, and you're free to choose your own path forward. Catherine stood wiping her eyes with the back of her hand. I want to stay for a while, she said. Not forever necessarily, but long enough to learn our language again, to hear the old stories, to remember what I can of who I used to be. And when you're ready to leave, if you choose to, then I'll leave, she said simply. But I'll always know where I came from. I'll always know that I have a brother who never gave up on me, even when the whole world thought I was dead. As they walked back toward the village, Catherine pulled out both lockets, and the one containing her mother's coin, and the one with her adoptive mother's photograph. I want to keep both, she said. They're both part of my story now. That's wise, Lone Bear said. Honor all who loved you. The village was preparing for a special ceremony, the welcome home ceremony reserved for tribal members who had been lost and found again. Catherine watched nervously as the preparations took place. What if I don't remember how to participate? She asked. You don't have to remember, Singing Bird said gently. You just have to feel. Your spirit knows the way, even if your mind has forgotten. As the sun set, the entire village gathered in a circle around a great fire. Catherine stood in the center with Lone Bear, feeling awkward and uncertain. But as the drums began and the singers raised their voices in the ancient welcoming song, something deep inside her responded. She found herself swaying to the rhythm, her body remembering movements her mind had forgotten. When the singers called for her to join them, she opened her mouth and discovered she knew the words not in her mind, but in her heart. The ceremony continued long into the night with storytelling, dancing, and the sharing of food. Catherine participated as much as she could, but when she struggled with a word or custom, the people around her helped without making her feel foolish. You're home now, Singing Bird said as the ceremony wound down. Not just in body, but in spirit. Catherine looked around at the faces glowing in the firelight, her people, her family, her heritage. For the first time in 16 years, she felt truly safe and truly herself. Wicasa, she said using his Comanche name. Thank you for finding me. Thank you for staying alive long enough to be found, he replied. Over the following months, Catherine divided her time between learning traditional ways and putting her education to use. She helped establish a school in the nearby town of Cedar Ridge, where both Comanche and white children could learn together. Her experiences in both worlds made her uniquely qualified to bridge the gap between cultures. She also worked with territorial authorities to help prevent the kind of violence that had destroyed her childhood. Her story became well known throughout the territory, inspiring others to look beyond surface differences and find common ground. But the most important moment came 6 months after her return during the spring planting ceremony. Catherine was helping with the traditional blessing of the seeds when she heard a familiar sound, the whinny of a horse. She turned to see Thunderwalker, the magnificent paint stallion that had been traded for her freedom. He was older now, his muzzle touched with gray, but still proud and strong. Children had braided flowers into his mane, and he wore a blanket decorated with the symbols of her clan. He's lived well, Lone Bear said, joining her beside the paddock. The whole village honors him as the horse who brought you home. Catherine reached out to touch the stallion's velvet nose. Thunderwalker nickered softly, as if he recognized her scent. He paid a high price for my freedom, she said. Some prices are worth paying, Lone Bear replied. And some trades benefit everyone involved. Catherine smiled, understanding at last the full meaning of what had happened in that dark mine. The Warhorse had been traded not just for her body, but for her soul. The exchange had brought her back to herself, back to her people, back to her true identity. She was Catherine Walker, the educated woman who had survived betrayal and found the courage to seek justice. She was Ayanna, the Comanche daughter, who had found her way home after 16 years of wandering. And she was something entirely new, a woman who had chosen her own identity, her own path, her own definition of belonging. The trade had been worth every sacrifice, every scar, every moment of pain. Thunderwalker had purchased not just a life, but a future filled with purpose and the deep satisfaction of being exactly who she was meant to be, standing there in the spring sunshine, surrounded by her family and her people. Catherine finally understood that some prices can only be paid with the heart, and some trades change the world forever.